안녕하세요. 자본시장연구원 김한수 연구위원입니다. 이번 KCMI 글로벌 이슈에서는 회복탄력 사회, 위기에 강한 사회는 어떻게 만들어지는가를 주제로 인터뷰를 진행하겠습니다. 먼저 오늘 주제에 대해 말씀해 주실 마르커스 브루노 마이어 교수님을 소개해드리겠습니다. 브루노 마이어 교수님은 현재 프린스턴 대학 경제학과 교수이시며 동대학 벤다임 센터 포 파이낸스 디렉터로 활동하고 계십니다. 브루노 마이어 교수님은 금융시장 버블 및 유동성, 통화가치 안정성 등에 관해 주로 연구해 오셨으며 미국 의회 예산국, 뉴욕 연방준비은행, IMF, 유럽 시스템 리스크 이사회 등의 자문위원으로 금융위기의 극복과 방지에 관한 다양한 조언을 제시해 주신 바 있습니다. 특히 최근에는 세계적 경제 석학들이 팬데믹 발발에 따른 충격과 해법을 논의하는 온라인 세미나인 마커스 아카데미를 운영하고 계시며 충격에 대한 회복탄력성의 개념을 소개하고 있는 저서 회복탄력 사회를 발간하셨습니다. 국제금융시장과 거시경제 분야의 세계적 전문가이신 브루노 마이어 교수님과 이렇게 이야기 나눌 수 있게 된 것을 정말 기쁘게 생각합니다. 말씀 나누기 전에 먼저 인터뷰를 시청하시는 분들께 인사 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you with the Korean Capital Market Institute, and hello to all the viewers from Korea and around the world. It's a pleasure to be here and to say a few words about the Resilient Society, the new book which I have written recently.
그럼 회복탄력 사회에 관한 인터뷰를 시작하겠습니다. 첫 번째 질문입니다. 최근 출간된 회복탄력 사회는 충격을 쉽게 극복하는 사회의 핵심 요소로 회복탄력성의 개념을 제시하고 있습니다. 그런데 회복탄력성이란 개념이 쉽게 이해되지는 않는 것 같습니다. 교수님께 먼저 회복탄력성의 개념에 대한 설명을 부탁드립니다. 또한 회복탄력성의 개념이 위기로부터의 회복과 더불어 장기적 지속 가능성의 개념을 동시에 포함하고 있는지에 대해서도 말씀을 부탁드립니다.
Yeah, so it's related to avoiding risk, but it's actually different from simply avoiding risk. So risk management is actually where you try to minimize the amplitude of a shock. So if there's a shock, and then how big the shock is, you would like to minimize it. It's typically measured, in terms of variance or standard deviation or value at risk. And in this figure, you see that there's an amplitude that goes down, let's say, a significant amount, but you try to limit it that it doesn't go down so much. Resilience is a dynamic concept. Risk management is a static concept. Resilience is all about how quickly you bounce back. So the shock itself, you can't really do much, but you position yourself in such a way that you can bounce back subsequently. So it's about mean reversion or the half-life of a shock. So it's, in this sense, it's different from simply avoiding risk. It's really much more dynamic than a static concept. And if you put it together, if you say, okay, now I want to avoid the risk all the time, of course, avoiding risk also means you cannot experiment, you cannot take risk, and hence your growth path is lower. So here what I've depicted in this picture is that you have this dashed line, that's the riskless path. If you don't take any risks, the growth rate, the slope of the riskless line is actually lower. But if you go for a resilient path, that's actually this curved line which goes and has shocks and comes back and goes back, falls down again. There's another recession and comes back. But you go for this more risky path, but with resilience, you have a larger expected growth path. So overall, you will outperform in the long run. And if you look at the third downturn, it's actually the case that, even after the downturn, you're still on top of the riskless path. So in the long run, you will be better off. It seems more risky, but ultimately it is not so risky as long as it is resilience. So that's the difference between resilience and simply avoiding risk. So you should actually take some risk, but you should take risk only when they come with some resilience. So resilience and robustness are really related concepts, but they're quite different as well. So robustness is about withstanding a shock. There's a shock, and you withstand the shock, and you block the shock and it doesn't hit you at all. While resilience is you take on the shock and then you bounce back afterwards because you react to the shock. And actually it's best illustrated by a French novel from the 17th century, where in this French writing, the writer La Fontaine compares the oak with the reed. The oak is a very strong tree. When the wind comes, it doesn't move much. It's very resisting all the winds, while the reed is very going back and forth as the wind comes, but it bounces back all the time. And in this fable, it's a story between where the oak and the reed are talking to each other. The oak says, "Oh, I am the mighty oak. I will, withstand all the shocks." While the reed says, "I will be flexible, adjusting and bouncing back." And at the end of the day, when there's a hurricane coming, then the oak falls over and can't come back up anymore. It breaks through a so-called tipping point or robustness barrier. And then the reed at the end says to the oak, "I bend, I bow, but I do not break." So essentially what it means, something which seems weak and volatile and constantly moving back and forth is at the end much stronger than something which is, seems very strong. And that's related to this volatility paradox. Something which is more volatile and can adjust and modify and be flexible, agile, at the end is more resilient and actually will survive in the longer term compared to something which is very strong but rigid and cannot adjust to that. In this sense, resilience and robustness is different. Resilience is much more being agile and flexible and adjust and bouncing back, literature and other things. Actually, resilience is part of sustainability. Sustainability is a bigger concept. Resilience, if something is not resilient, it's not sustainable. But if something is resilient, it's not necessarily sustainable already. So you need more than resilience. So you need resilience and no adverse trend. So this figure shows here where actually there's a resilient path. So whenever there's a downturn, you come back. And then there's a second downturn, you come back, third downturn, and come back. So it's a resilient path, but the whole trend is downward sloping. So hence it's not sustainable. So being resilient alone is not enough for sustainability. So you need resilience and no adverse trend. If you have both of that, then you essentially have a sustainability. So you can connect resilience concept also with sustainability. It's an ingredient for sustainability.
답변 감사드립니다. 다음 질문입니다. 회복탄력성이란 위험을 회피하기보다는 갈대와 같이 충격을 흡수함으로써 장기적 성장세를 제고하는 위험 관리에 보다 효율적인 개념이라고 이해됩니다. 그렇다면 우리가 회복탄력성을 높이기 위해서는 무엇이 필요할까요? 또한 회복탄력성을 저해하는 요소 및 이를 극복하기 위한 방안에는 어떠한 것들이 있을까요?
So essentially it's key to move away from, simply minimizing risk and avoiding risk at any cost. It is actually important to go for more resilience. And that means you can take some risk as long as you have some parallel strategy. When, the shock happens, you can bounce back from that. And you, on the one hand, you want to contain the impact of the crisis, but importantly, you want to bounce back. And you might even bounce back to a better normal subsequently. And that's what I call uber resilience. So that's essentially what resilience is all about. And as you mentioned in the question, there's some resilience enhancers, which you adopt and strengthen the resilience enhancers, and you watch out for resilience destroyers. So the resilience destroyers are really the things to watch out for. So what are the resilience enhancers? So first, you want to have redundancies and buffers. You want to have a little bit of additional inventory. Just in time is a little bit risky. You want to have a little bit of inventory to really have some resilience enhancers. But what's more important is the flexibility, liquidity, and adaptability. And how can you achieve that? If you make your production line, for example, in such a way that you can easily switch from one input to another input, so that you can substitute more easily across various inputs. So in particular, if you give in a particular example, if you in the car manufacturing, you might use a particular chip for the steering wheel and another chip for the door, but you might also use a more generic chip which you can use for the steering wheel and for the door. And if one of the two breaks down, you can actually switch from one chip to another chip very easily because it's a flexible design. So when you design a product, you want to design it in such a way that you can easily substitute one input for another input. Another important element for making it easier to change things is if you have an infrastructure where you can easily transport units from one part of the country to another part of the country, or you have a better digitalization in your world, so you can actually handle shocks much more easily. And on third element, which makes substitutability easier, if you have standardized things. So if you standardize, like in this chip, you have one standardized chip for the steering wheel and the door, you can standardize many things. So this way you can replace one for the other more easily. So substitutability, flexibility, design in such a way that you can adapt to shocks, I think is very, very important. The third element is diversity. So you would like to have a system which is very diverse. So here I've depicted a forest of trees was like a monoculture, or you have a forest which is, has different types of trees. And what happens is if there's a shock to the system and all trees are the same, you wipe out all the forest, the whole forest. While if you have a very heterogeneous forest, then actually you wipe out some of the trees and not the other trees. So any shock is much more idiosyncratic. Some trees might benefit, the other trees might really be hurt. But if you have a forest with the same tree all the time, then it's actually the case that the whole forest will be wiped out. So all shocks are not idiosyncratic, they are systematic. So you want to set up a system that's just for a forest, but for any system that's true, which is more heterogeneous. Do we want to allow for people who think differently? You want to have some mavericks in the organization as well. You don't want the total homogeneity. I think that's more dangerous in this sense. But on the other hand, and that's probably sounds a little bit contradictory, you want to have a social cohesion in your society, in your company, where people work in the same direction. So they all have a same vision, a similar vision, and also, feel some joint identity. So that's also important to have a good resilience. And finally, and I devote the next slide to that, is that you want to allow for smaller shocks on crises. You don't want to prevent any crisis because you learn from smaller crises. So what's the advantage of living through smaller crises? It is essentially, if you use all your resources, all your buffers, from avoiding the smaller crisis. So in this picture, again, I have my resilient part, that's the blue line here. And then I have some policy or some elements where you would say, I will follow the black dashed line and avoid the first two crises. But then what happens, I've used up all my buffers for the first two crises, and then the third crisis comes along. The third crisis I cannot handle anymore. It will be much bigger. And actually, more importantly, I cannot bounce back to the old growth path. So it's not resilient. So using up all the buffers for smaller crises is not a wise strategy. You would actually want to smooth it out and also have for later shocks something. So it's actually good to live through some crises, because you also learn from smaller crises how to handle bigger crises. It's a little bit like the human immune system. If you never are exposed to any bacteria or viruses in your childhood, you will be easily hit later in your adult life with some viruses and will be less immune to the system. To your immune system will be less developed. So it's actually good to go through some sicknesses when you're a child. As long as they're not too big, you want to go through some crises to learn from that. And the third reason why you would like to, not at any cost avoid smaller crises, because when you have smaller crises, imbalances are building up, and this imbalance is building up makes things even worse. And so you don't want this imbalances building up. And you can see that, when you have a financial crisis, typically a financial crisis, there is a bubble emerging, and the bubble, everything becomes more pronounced, and then the bubble bursts, and then you have a financial crisis. And then for the financial crisis, it's hard to come back to the old growth path. So what I've depicted in this figure is for Japan, the GDP, and the slope is the GDP growth, and the dashed lines are they projected if the economy were growing as it was growing before the financial crisis. And you can see after the financial crisis, like the 1990s Japanese banking crisis or the financial crisis in late 2000s, it is the case that it never came back to the old shock, to the old growth path. Not only don't you come back, the expected growth path, the slope is actually lower, so the expected growth is actually subsequently lower as well. So you want to avoid that you run into the buildup of imbalances over time, and make situation worse and worse, and then you can't bounce back. You destroy resilience. Now, having got done it, so what are the real resilience destroyers, and what you want to look out for is traps, feedbacks, and tipping points. And I'm going back to my old figure with this resilient part, but now I put a horizontal line in it, and that's a trap line. So you can see if I have a choice again between this resilient path and the riskless path, now with a trap, the picture changes, because now when the first downturn comes, I hit the trap and then I'm stuck. I can't come back up anymore. So in that case, if there are traps, I want to go for the riskless dashed line, because I know the resilient part is actually not happening because I will be trapped at the horizontal line here. And so the traps is something I want to look out for, because there's a point of no return. Once I'm trapped, I will be trapped there. What's even more dangerous are feedbacks. So feedbacks are things where, something happens, person A is doing something, then there's an externality to person B suffers, person B then reacts to that, and it calls a spill back. And then person A suffers from the reaction of person B, and the person B reacts even more. And then there causes an second externality, second round effects for person B, and so forth, and the third round effects, fourth round effect, and the whole spirals coming into play. And that calls for these feedback effects, which make the initial shock way bigger and way more dramatic, and it's very hard to come back. And if these feedback effects typically come when tipping points kick in. And the next figure you see, instead of having this horizontal line to be a trap, now I have a tipping point. And that means when you hit the tipping point, whole hell breaks loose and you go down and down and down, even further down. So that's essentially, feedbacks come often when they hit a tipping point, and that's what you want to look out for. So the resilience destroyers are traps, feedbacks, and tipping points. Once you have these, you have to really look out for them. You might want to go for the riskless strategy rather than for the risky strategy, because it's the traps, the feedbacks, the tipping points typically destroy the resilience, and that's what you want to look out for. Of course, there is also always a counterexample. It's not always the case whenever there is a tipping point you want to go for the riskless strategy. And here's a counterexample. And you see this often in the environmental arena, where there's a tipping point as before, and there's the resilience strategy. If the riskless strategy leads to a negative trend, and you will hit the tipping point for sure, like in this example, the light blue dashed line, you will hit the tipping point for sure, then it will be the case that actually you have to use the resilience strategy to escape the tipping point. So that's an example. We're going for resilience strategy, like the dark blue line, which bounces back all the time. It allows you to escape the tipping point. So it's not whenever there's a tipping point, you should not go for resilience strategy. It is the case you have to watch more carefully whether to go for that.
답변 감사드립니다. 그렇다면 회복 탄력성의 개념은 경제사회적 충격으로부터 과거 성장세로의 회복 또는 평균 회귀만을 의미하는 건가요? 장기적으로 회복 탄력성과 성장세는 어떠한 관계가 있는지에 대해서도 말씀 부탁드립니다.
That's actually a good point. And that leads me to uber resilience, or it's also related to the concept of anti-fragility. So far, we talked about, you want to bounce back to the old growth path or to the old situation you have been before. But sometimes a shock leads to a bouncing back to not to the old path, but to a new normal, to something even better before you started. And that's essentially when you use a shock to really change things. And that's related often to what's referred to as QWERTY problem. So what's a QWERTY problem? If you look at the keyboard in the US or in England, it's the alignment of the letters on the keyboard is with Q, W, E, R, T, Y, so QWERTY. And you might wonder why the keyboard was designed this way. And the keyboard was designed this way in order to maximize the efficiency from the old typewriters, which were the old typewriter where the hammers come out in the typewriter. Of course, these days we have computers and iPhones and smartphones and Samsung and so forth. And why do we still have the same type of keyboard? That makes no sense at all. But we are stuck in this setting where we're familiar with this particular structure of a keyboard, even though we could have much better designs, and we don't do that. And this is just an example where a simple, trivial example, where we are stuck in circumstances where, because we're used to it, we don't re-optimize. And sometimes when you have a shock, you can use the shock to really jump to a better outcome, to a new normal, which is superior to the old normal. And I've depicted here on the other side of the figure, on the right side, you can see the ball is stuck in position A and cannot get out, even though position B is much better. So if you go down further, it's a better in this illustration. And once you have this shock, you might have a jump, a QWERTY jump, to get away from this position A to position B. And what are these examples? One example is, for example, telemedicine. Before the Corona crisis, telemedicine was not so common. Now, after Corona, became way more prominent because suddenly all the regulation was removed, which hindered telemedicine. Another example is home office. Before the Corona crisis, home office was attached with a stigma, so it was not very well not used. So people were viewed badly upon to stay at home. But now with Corona, home office is a natural thing to do, at least for some professions. And that actually leads to an outcome which we probably can be more efficient down the road if for particular professions we do a lot of home office arrangements. Same is true for online learning, for conferences, for the use of digital money, digital payments, and so forth. So there is a lot of possibility if you have a shock to use the shock to re-optimize and go to a new normal, which is better than the old normal. So not only bouncing back to the old normal, but bouncing to some new normal, which is, what I call uber resilience, because it's more than resilience. The shock is used to actually improve the situation. So all of this, if you think about it, what you want is, you don't want to avoid shocks at any cost. You want to be exposed to some shocks, in particular if it comes with experimentation, higher growth rate, but you want to watch out for these resilience killers or resilience destroyers. And you also want to use certain shocks. You want to adjust in such a way you might actually use it to break away from old local minima or local maxima to go to a better outcome in the long run.
답변 감사드립니다. 다음 질문입니다. 코로나19와 같은 최근의 사태는 개인주의적 행동이 외부 효과를 통해 회복력에 한계를 미치고 있다는 사실을 여실히 보여주고 있습니다. 그렇다면 사회적인 측면에서 회복 탄력성의 개념은 어떠한 방식으로 접근해야 하는지, 개인적인 측면과 사회적 측면에서 회복 탄력성의 개념의 차이점은 어디에 있는지에 대해서 말씀 부탁드립니다.
So that's a very good point. Actually, resilience comes at three levels. It comes at the individual level, it comes at system levels, and it comes at the level of the society. And so individual resilience is all about personal well-being. If you suffer personal shock, will you bounce back? What's about your mental health and so forth? So individual resilience is very important, and it's dealing with a lot of psychological problems. And there's, as you said, there is a psychological literature out there. Now, then there's resilience of the system. One system is the economy, the Korean economy, for example. It could be, systems are typically networks. It could be the economy, it could be the electric grid, it could be the interbank market, it could be global value chains. And then it depends a little how the system, how the network is set up. And there are three different ways you can set up networks, or at least three different ways. You can have a centralized one, a decentralized one, what are depicted in the middle here, or a distributed network. And what you can see here, that the centralized network is least resilient, because if you hit the central node, the whole network is going down. While the distributed network is the most resilient. If you hit the node, it will rebuild itself And if you think about how is our brain wired, our brain is also a distributed network. So if parts of the brain goes down, other parts of the brains adopt and take on the parts which are not working anymore. So distributed networks are much more resilient. So it's very important to have actually a network structure which is more resilient. And if you design, a company or design an economy, you would like to go for more distributed network structures rather than very centralized network structures for resilience purposes. Now, you might say, now, what's the difference between a system and society? Isn't the society also a network of people interconnected to each other? And that's actually true, but society is a special system, a special network. And because if you have a system, you can actually let the part of the network go down. You have some circuit breakers, so if the electricity network goes down, part of it, you protect the rest. But a society, you can't really let a part of the network go down. So in a system like the economy, you can let firms go bankrupt and replace them with new. That makes the whole economy more resilient if you have a good bankruptcy law. But for society, you cannot let really people, go down in a sense. That's in this sense, a resilience of a society is different, even though it's also a network. And for society, then we go to some resilience, which structures we want for the economy and for society more generally. And it goes back to the work by Hayek, who actually introduced this concept or developed this concept further, a spontaneous order. So a spontaneous order is essentially an order where things evolve on its own, while the other one is a more designed order. So what's different about the resilience of a society? Society's interaction among humans, and you cannot just let part of society go down. You want to have an inclusive approach. You want to bring everybody into the picture and have the resilience of everybody. So the resilience of society implies that all individuals are resilient. And that's important. And also the system effects, like the spillover effects, are also contained. And what's the second element which makes the resilience of the society more interesting is that whether a system is resilient or not depends on the responses of individuals onto each other's actions. And that depends on what they believe others will do in certain circumstances. So it is all about expectations about people's behavior. And then we go back to our feedback externalities. If person A thinks he does something causes an externality on person B, and person B then reacts to that, and then person B has to think, well, how will then subsequently person A react to that? So all these feedback effects, they are much more pronounced in a world where people can react based on what they believe others will do in the future. And sometimes say that we have met the enemy and he is in us. So one has to think about how the reaction occurs. And some examples are bank runs. You have to think, if others run on the bank, I want to run on the banks as well. So that's where capital markets elements come into play, but it's all about expectations, what the others will do. And you might end up in a bad equilibrium. And that happens in this societal resilience aspects, which are very important to keep in mind. So let me summarize. So resilience comes at different levels: in the individual level, the system level, and the society level. Society level requires resilience of all individuals, but also take into account what the spillover effects are in terms of what the systemic elements of the system resilience is also present in the society. And on top of it, it comes that you have the expectations of individuals are very critical in order to understand whether society is resilient or not.
답변 감사드립니다. 마지막 질문입니다. 최근 급등하고 있는 물가 상승률 및 경기 침체의 함정 등 다가오는 위기에 대응하기 위해서는 어떠한 접근과 전략이 필요할까요? 특히 대외 불확실성에 민감한 한국 경제는 회복 탄력 사회 구축을 위해 어떠한 장기적 접근 방식을 마련해야 하는지에 대해서 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다.
Yeah, so the global economy is very important for many societies, also for the global society and for Korea in particular, because Korea, is such a open economy and very exposed to exports and imports and so forth. So our geopolitical arrangement was essentially that we wanted, before the recent events in Corona and also the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, that we wanted to create some mutual interdependencies. And in Korea, it was essentially that you had a political ally with the United States, but you had a lot of close economic ties with China. And you created some mutual interdependencies, and this created itself some international stability, because whenever somebody were to undo the peace or do something not favorable to the other nation, it would also backfire, because people are mutually interdependent, or countries are mutually interdependent. And a classic example, or most pronounced example, if you have just-in-time delivery or in global value chains, then it is the case that if something happens bad in one country, it hits the other country as well. So no country wants to cause really some damage to the other country, because it will backfire right away, because you're hugely exposed through, for example, just-in-time global value chains. And that is created some stability. Paradoxically, this created some stability because you don't want to behave strangely or a disadvantage to your neighboring country, because it will backfire. And that was the philosophy which led to a stable arrangement across different political systems and so forth. And overall, new technology like containers and other technology led to this extreme boom of globalization since the 70s and 80s. And Korea was one of the big beneficiaries of globalization, really expanding dramatically. But we had, from the early 2000s onwards, we had some globalization already, meaning that globalization was slowing down, but it stayed at a high level. It stayed at a high level with regard to goods. If you look at services, actually in terms of services, it expanded even further. So globalization is still going on. But the challenge is now, what happens? Are we staying in this world of mutual interdependencies? Or are we going to a different arrangement, global arrangement? Now, after the invasion of Russia to the Ukraine and after Corona, it's all about resilience. By mutual interdependencies, you're weak compared to your trading partner. You're intentionally weak because, if I were to do something bad, it would hurt me, it would backfire. But if you want to be resilient to any of these shocks, you're not weak anymore. So you not have this mutual interdependence anymore. And instead of having just in time, you go for just in case. You have some more autarky, you have more self-reliance. That means you have less global stability, because if you were to do something strange now to your neighboring country, it would not backfire so much. And that also means that we have to think about a global architecture, which actually, for geopolitical reasons, makes the whole world more resilient. So by each country trying to be more resilient, makes the whole global structure less resilient. That's essentially this resilience paradox in the international arena. This also will lead to high inflation if you cut back on global value chains. And so that's also a side effect. The big decision now, the big policy decision, the fork in the road, is whether we go for fragmentation. Are we going on global trade for reshoring, friendshoring, or multi-sourcing? So what are these? So reshoring means the advanced economies, they bring a lot of the production capacity back to themselves. So the capacity moves back to US, Germany, and so forth. That's one approach, and that will lead to less globalization. A second approach, which US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has proposed, is friendshoring. You bring production capacity back to your friends, and that raises a question: who is your friend, and who decides whether some country is a friendly nation or not? And the third question is, and who decides if it switches, if you suddenly decide, okay, now it's not a friendly nation anymore, and then you have to change the production allocations. So that's also very tricky, and it's not clear this will actually be beneficial from a global perspective. And the third approach is multi-sourcing. So if you put yourself in the shoes of a US company, you can say, okay, I have outsourced some of my production capacities to China, and I have 2 firms in China. It might be in the future, you might say, that's too risky if something were to happen in China, because China follows a no COVID or zero COVID strategy. That's risky. So rather than having two firms in China, you will have one firm in China, one in Africa, and one in Latin America. And this way I spread the risk much more and have also some extra capacity across various continents. And that multi-sourcing approach seems to me a more resilient approach. And it also means that you don't fragment the world. And also you have, because you go for this resilience, it is more resilient than the reshoring. So reshoring approach is essentially only allowing you to bring everything back to your home country, but also something might go badly in your home country, and then you're also in trouble because the home production capacities are destroyed. So that's about global trade. And that's actually what is very important also for Korea, given that Korea is such important exporter of technology for the rest of the world. Now, what's about, instead of trade, what's about global financial architecture, about the finance aspects? And what's Koreans' challenge is also that the US interest rates are increasing. What is the effect of that? So typically, whenever US interest rates are increasing, there's capital flow into the United States because it becomes more attractive to hold a global safe asset, which is the US Treasury. And there's capital flow into the United States out of the emerging economies. And we often move from a risk on to a risk off phenomenon. So risk on means investors are happy to take on risk. And if we move to risk off world, suddenly investors are not happy to take on risks anymore. So there's a risk off switch to that. And that's essentially where the US monetary policy comes into play. And last fall, in fall 2021, the US Federal Reserve had to make a judgment call whether to hike the interest rates early on or to wait and hike it more dramatically later. And that's essentially, that's the red line. So if we look at here in this figure, there's the interest rate on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. The blue one would have been an earlier hike, but less dramatic one. The red one is a more dramatic, a delayed hike, but much more dramatically. And you have to do this once inflation kicks in to make sure the inflation anchor is not lost, so-called Taylor principle. So you have to make sure that inflation anchor is not lost. And this dramatic, sharp hike of the US monetary policy has implications for all emerging economies in developing countries as well. So because the US Treasury suddenly becomes a much more attractive safe asset, safe haven asset, and all the capital is flowing out of the emerging economies into the US. So the response then is for the emerging economies is also to hike the interest rates. In order to keep up with the high US interest rates, you also have to hike the emerging economies like the Korean interest rate, even though Korea is an advanced economy, but they also hike the interest rates. And by hiking the interest rates, you squeeze essentially the growth rate of the economy because you also slow down your own economy. And what's particular about Korea, you have this Gen Z loan challenge on top of it. If the central bank or the Bank of Korea is hiking interest rates, and then actually households can borrow less to rent homes. So in this Korean arrangement, and this actually might hurt house prices and might lead to a decline in house prices. But I'm not an expert on this Gen Z loan arrangement in order to say things, but a hiking of the interest rates might have some side effects on the Korean house prices, and it slows down the economy in Korea as well. So you can see how the US monetary policy is spilling over and causing some anti-resilience because it spills over and makes it harder to bounce back for the Korean economy after Corona because of the side effects of high inflation in the United States, higher US monetary policy, much higher monetary policy in the US, higher inflation also in Korea. Korea has to hike interest rates as well, and that also might then impact the house prices in Korea as well. And more generally, there's this outflow of capital. So here what I've depicted a figure from a forthcoming book I have with Ricardo Reis on how to teach financial crisis. And you can see the in and outflows. The green bars are the inflows and the red bars are the outflows. And you see these huge outflows. So you see earlier shocks, the global financial crisis, 2008, some outflows, Lehman crisis. you see the taper tantrum outflows, and you see many of these outflows. But you see also in 2020 huge dramatic outflows when COVID started in March 2020. And then the Fed reacted, cut the interest rate, stabilized the system, the global financial system, and then actually were inflows into the emerging economies. That you see the subsequent green bars in the late 2020, 2021. But then in 2022 now, as the Fed is hiking the interest rates, you see huge capital outflows again from the emerging economies. And typically, what's a big challenge for that? The challenge is when there's risk coming and investors don't want to go into risky assets anymore, they're going to safe haven assets. There's flight to safety, and the safe haven asset is provided by the advanced economies. And so you get this flight to safety from the emerging economies into the US in particular. And typically, investors want to go from a more risky assets into safer assets, but the problem is the safe asset is not symmetrically supplied across the globe. It's not supplied by all countries in the world. It's supplied by only a few advanced economies, and hence it leads to cross-border capital flows. It leads to this huge capital flows towards the United States, towards Germany and Japan. And what it means in times of crisis, when the volatility goes up, actually the finance minister or the US Treasury Secretary in the United States can issue new bonds very cheaply at a very low interest rate, while emerging economies have to pay a high interest rate. Or put it differently, when there's a financial crisis or there's financial downturns, the interest rate, the real interest rate at which the US can issue bonds is very low, and so it can run counter-cyclical fiscal policy very easily, while the emerging economies cannot do that. The emerging economies, whenever there's a global financial crisis, their bond price is depressed, or put it differently, the interest rate is heightened, the real interest rate is heightened, and it wasn't the financing conditions exactly in the financial crisis, so hence they have to run austerity measures rather than counter-cyclical fiscal policy. And put it different, there's another paradox: the poor essentially insure the rich paradox. So that's, from an international perspective, particular challenges for the Korea, because Korea is such an open economy, so an important global player, also in the global economy and the technology front and many other dimensions where Korea has to watch out in order to stay resilient as well. So let me use this opportunity and say thank you for giving me this opportunity to present here here in Korea with the KCMI, and it's a great pleasure to be with you and present my work at your forum. Thank you.
답변 감사드립니다. 지금까지 브루노 바이어 교수님과 함께 교수님의 최근 저서 회복탄력 사회에 대해 이야기를 나누어 보았습니다. 깊은 통찰과 분석을 바탕으로 좋은 말씀 나눠주신 브루노 바이어 교수님께 감사드립니다. 특히 최근 글로벌 경기 침체 리스크가 점차 확대되고 있는 시점에서 회복탄력적 시스템 구축에 필요한 다양한 요소 및 시사점을 제시해 주셨다는 점에서 매우 유익한 시간이었습니다. 아무쪼록 근본 KCMI 글로벌 이슈가 우리가 앞으로 마주할 다양한 위험 요인에 대비해 회복탄력성의 개념을 정확히 이해하고 활용하는 데 도움이 되시길 바랍니다. 지금까지 인터뷰를 시청해 주셔서 감사합니다.